guys, so today we're gonna dissect what makes a phrase sound good. What are the components that make a phrase work? And furthermore, how can you actually use these components so you yourself can play good sounding phrases? We're gonna talk about 5 different components that you can consider. We're gonna check out phrases from a release that we just did with jazz lesson videos called 50 Easy Major Phrases. A lot of what we talk about on this channel is very difficult, but a huge part of actually being able to play phrases that sound good is going back to the basics and getting into language that is short, sweet, and accessible. So what are some of the components to consider with phrases that sound good? A lot of times when you're playing a gig or you're seeing a show where somebody plays a phrase and the crowd or audience goes, woo, they do like the jazz, like, oh man, that sounds good, that feels good. What are the components that happen there? A lot of times, and the first thing that we're gonna talk about today, a lot of times I have found that those phrases tend to be short. For instance, a lot of times when people think of Charlie Parker, they think of these long, winding, complex phrases. And it's true that he was able to do that, and he often did do that, but many of Bird's greatest solos were just one chorus solos where he was playing a lot of phrases that only lasted a couple bars. So again, the first component that we're gonna consider here is start short. So to start out, let's check out a short phrase. This phrase is just about a bar long. The total amount of notes in this phrase is just 10 notes, and you'll see that just about every single note is a chord tone. This phrase is on a short 2-5-1, which is something that comes up in all sorts of tunes. A short 2-5-1 where you just have 2 beats on every chord is probably the most common chord progression that you will see in all of jazz standards. So it's really important to be able to have a handle on this chord progression. And again, what we see here is we're using almost exclusively chord tones. In fact, if you consider the 9th a chord tone, it is actually exclusively chord tones. So let's analyze these notes. So our first chord here is C minor 7. We're starting on the 3rd, jumping down to the 5th, going up to the 7th, and then playing the 9th after that. Now, strictly speaking, some people will say that chord tones are just the 1, 3, 5, 7 in general with a chord like this, but a lot of people will include the 6 and the 9 because that's typically how a pianist or a guitarist is going to voice the chord. So again, to start, we have 3, 5, 7, 9, then we voice lead down into the 5th of F7. Voice leading is just a smooth transition from chord to chord using a melodic line. A lot of times it uses close intervals. We're going to talk about that in a second. So we land on the 5th of F7, and again, we just continue with only chord tones. We play the 5th, the 3rd, the root, the 7th on the bottom. That voice leads with stepwise motion down into the 3rd of B flat major 7, and we hop up to the root. So again, we have a short phrase here, and what we're also seeing is we end very deliberately. We just have a couple snappy notes here to end the phrase. Which brings us to the second component to consider here is end deliberately. Typically when you hear in the audience that jazz woo, as we like to call it, when you hear that woo, when somebody plays a really nice phrase, that happens in between phrases. That happens after the end of a phrase. And it typically happens when the end of a phrase is really good. So you have to make sure that you end your phrase deliberately. It's just like if you were to be giving a public speech, the end of your sentence is the most important part. You really have to conclude your point well. So that's what we're doing when we're improvising these phrases. So now let's check out a slightly longer phrase. This is gonna be more like a 4-bar phrase, but the ending is gonna be very deliberate. And what you're gonna see here is we're actually doing a long 2-5-1 here. So again, so much of what we see in jazz standards is 2-5-1 progressions. That's why it's so important to be well versed in this progression and language that works over this progression, which will of course eventually help you improvise your own language over 2-5-1 progressions. But what we're gonna see here is another phrase that uses almost exclusively chord tones. And with it being longer, we just have a little bit more rhythmic variation. So what we're gonna see here is we start on the 5th, we go descending to the 3rd, the root, and the 7th, and then we voice lead, again, seeing this voice leading down into the 3rd of F7. Then right after arpeggiating down, we end up arpeggiating up. So from the F7, we play the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th. We add some syncopation here. We've got a longer phrase, so it's nice to break things up a little bit. But we still voice lead with stepwise motion, even though we're just breaking up the rhythm a little bit, down into the 3rd of B flat major 7. Then from there, we've got the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th. And here's where we really end the phrase deliberately. We've got the root and the 6th. The 6th on a major chord is a really nice note. It has a lot of color to it. It's not bland. And if you put a little sustain on it, it's gonna be a really melodic way of ending a phrase. All right, so a third component to consider is using close intervals. A lot of times when I hear a more developing player and they're just sort of pushing buttons over a scale or uncertain of the next thing that they're gonna play, a lot of times what I find is happening in their lines is they're sort of poking at notes randomly that end up being maybe a little bit more spread out. Typically something that you're gonna find in a melodic line is that the intervals actually stay very close. So in this phrase, you're gonna see that there's a lot more happening than just chord tones. There's a lot of chromatic approach notes here, which we're gonna talk about in a second. But despite everything going on in this phrase, we never hop more than a major third from note to note. So again, the largest interval here from note to note is never going to go beyond a major third. And actually, the first couple of notes accomplish that interval when we go from the root to the third. After that, we do a chromatic enclosure, we'll talk about this more in a second, around the 7th of the chord. And you'll see with this phrase, it's just over straight B flat major 7. A lot of people ask me how you can make something sound more interesting when you're just on the same chord for a few bars. Adding melodic chromaticism, which we'll talk about in a second, is one way. But also another nice thing to do is imply an arpeggio that sits within the diatonic arpeggios of that chord, but is not actually arpeggiating that chord. Okay, so that might sound confusing, but an example of that is right here. We're arpeggiating now, starting on the 7th of this chord, an A half diminished 7, which is an arpeggio that sits inside the B flat major scale. So essentially, we're outlining a chord that works nicely within that chord. From there, we do a nice rhythmic embellishment and chromatic enclosure around the 5th, and then another nice snappy ending here. We just play the 5th and the 3rd to close off the phrase. All right, now a fourth component to consider is try pentatonics. Pentatonics are 5-note scales that by nature sound very melodic. So when you're using them, if you play them confidently, it's gonna be a pretty safe bet for being a nice phrase. And so checking out this phrase that uses only the notes in the pentatonic scale, you're gonna see we don't need to just play straight 8th notes. In this phrase, you'll see there are a lot of quarter notes, so what we're doing is we're really emphasizing the sound of this pentatonic scale. We start the phrase by playing a quarter note starting on the 5th. We play a couple 8th notes that bring us back to that 5th. We jump up to the root from there, skipping 1 degree in the scale, but we had already played that degree in the scale just before it. Then we do that same exact idea, just building up the scale, which brings us to the 3rd. Then we play a couple more quarter notes, so we're really embellishing that sound. Add some syncopation at the end, just playing straight right up the scale, and bringing it back to the root to end the phrase. All right, so the last thing to consider is master chromaticism. Obviously, that's a lot easier said than done, but when you can play the in-between notes really melodically, that just sounds so good. So it's important to try to get into the idea of melodic chromaticism just a little bit so you can have a lot more variation in the sound of your phrases. So in this phrase, you'll see that we have a bunch of chromaticism to start here. But in the rest of the phrase, it's just straight scale notes, mainly even just the chord tones. So really the hardest part of this phrase is just the beginning. It's this big 4-note enclosure that brings us into the 7th of F7. So it might look confusing, but all we're doing is we're taking 2 chromatic notes from below the note that we end up landing on, and 2 chromatic notes from above. So we're landing on E flat in this case. We take the C sharp and D below it, so we're moving chromatically up into it. And then before we land on the note, we jump above and we take the 2 chromatic notes above it. And then we move down into the note. That might look hard, but there are only so many chromatic approach notes and enclosures that you're really gonna do. There are only so many in-between notes and only so many ways to use them very melodically. So then after that enclosure, all we do is we just play chord tones going down. Again, we're landing on the 7th, then we play the 5th, then we play the 3rd. We connect with stepwise motion down into the 5th of the next chord. And then we just end the phrase with the 5th and the 3rd. Nice snappy ending. Again, this is another one of our short major 2-5-1s. So that chromaticism might have looked hard, but if you think about it, there are only so many in-between notes. There are only so many chromatic enclosures and chromatic approach notes that we're really gonna do in a phrase. So if there are only so many ways to do this melodically, the most important thing is to learn phrases like this through the keys. When you learn a phrase in another key, it goes beyond just pushing buttons and you truly internalize the sound of that phrase. When you truly internalize the sound of that phrase, you're truly internalizing the language that makes that phrase work. When you do that, that's when you're able to start improvising your own phrases really effectively. You have to learn the language thoroughly first before you can truly speak it. There's no magic answer to mastering the language of jazz improvisation, but one of the most valuable things you can do from a mechanical perspective is learn phrases through the keys. That's honestly why with all the books that we make, we put the phrases through all 12 keys so you can use that as a way of helping you get to the point of memorization. And once you've memorized enough concepts and devices through the language that you're learning, that's when you're going to get to the point where you won't even need the sheet music for this stuff. And then you're going to get to the point where you can improvise these phrases on your own and you're going to really be speaking the language. There's a massive world of resources out there for you, from recordings to books like this. I spent a lifetime refining the phrases in my own playing. And with these PDF packages, there's a really nice opportunity to transfer these ideas into a resource that you guys can use yourself. As I mentioned, it includes the phrases written through the keys, it includes backing tracks through the keys, and it also has recordings of me playing the phrases, so you have that as a reference for how you can feel and articulate these phrases. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Make sure to give this video a like if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Feel free to check out my website for tour dates. Always so fun to see you guys out there on the road. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.